Yes, welcome to this lecture today. First of all, just a few practical pieces of information. There are two emergency exits, one there and one there. So, in case of emergency, go out and gather at the corner of the Palace Park. There's coffee and biscuits, and you are welcome to fill up your cups during the lecture if you do it quietly. And then I would like to remind you that do not forget to turn on your mobile phones after the lecture. Okay? A very warm welcome to Professor Mary Fulbrook. I would just say a few introductory words about Mary. She did her undergraduate studies at Newnham College at Cambridge and her postgraduate work at Harvard University. She has held numerous fellowships and positions in British academia, among them head of the German department at the University College London, where she is now. And she is currently the Executive Dean of the UCL's Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences. Moreover, she is a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Memorial Foundation for the former Nazi concentration camps of Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora. She has established herself as one of the foremost historians on Germany in the UK, perhaps the most distinguished professor of German history. My first encounter with her was her concise history of Germany. I think it was in the very early 90s. And the book offers a very insightful overview of the twists and turns of the history of the German people and their land down the centuries. But Mary is also an historian of more specialized subjects, and that leads me to the topic this evening. A question frequently asked concerning the Nazi era is what and when did everyday Germans know about the crimes being committed in their name? In her latest book, Bystander Society, Conformity and Complicity in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, Mary argues that this is the wrong question to ask. The most interesting question is, how did the Germans act in response to what they knew about the transgressions of the Nazi regime? And was it by any means possible to stay aloof or detached from the Holocaust and other war events, just to be a bystander or an onlooker? As we can understand, in this new book, she takes on one of the most fraught topics in modern European history, namely the role of ordinary Germans in enabling both the rise of Nazism and then in the exclusion, persecution, and finally the extermination of millions of Europeans. How did people in Germany interpret and act or fail to act upon what they knew, and how did they become complicit? The book can be bought in the bookshop after the lecture, so I urge you to to do that because it's only sold here today, not otherwise in Norwegian bookshops. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your talk. And after the lecture, Research Director of the Holocaust Center, Ellen Stensrud, will share her thoughts with us and give her comments. So please, Mary.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honoured to be here today. And thank you also, all of you, for being willing to listen to me talking in English, since, alas, I don't command Norwegian, and all Norwegians who I've met in the 24 hours or so I've been in the country seem to speak perfect English, so I'm very grateful to you indeed for that. This is a really difficult topic, and it's one that's, in a way, bothered me all my life, because I have never liked the notion that's so prevalent in Britain and in the States to some extent, but among many countries, that all Germans are bad Germans. On the other hand, I've also been extremely irritated with the view that many Germans put out, that they never knew anything about it, that they were always against it, that they were in emigration, that they tried to save a Jew. And I just really puzzled about what actually was the role of ordinary Germans. So my book, Bystander Society, is actually not about the elites, the main actors, the big political actors, Hitler and his henchmen, the people we all sort of know about, nor is it about the opponents, the resistors, the political opposition that we also know a lot but not nearly enough about, nor is it actually about the victims very much, although they clearly come into it, and I pursue individual stories of people who are being persecuted. I'm trying to use the stories of those who left accounts of their experiences to understand the wider role of ordinary German people. So I'm taking this notion of bystanders, and I understand in a discussion at lunchtime today that Norwegian, like German, has no specific word for bystander. You can't just translate it. In German, I always get annoyed when people say Zuschauer, onlookers, because actually one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the way in which people chose to be looking away, Wegschauer, choosing not to see, not to know, to ignore. So I don't think Zuschauer or onlookers really does it. What I have argued in this book is that bystanding is not intrinsic to a person, but it's a relational category. It's intrinsic to a context. It's somebody who is by chance witness to a conflict between others, between direct perpetrators and their immediate victims. They are present in time and space, but only momentarily can they be a bystander. It's an intrinsically unstable concept. Unlike victim, if you're persecuted, you're persecuted. If you're a Jew in 1933, you're still being persecuted if you're in Germany in 1943. A bystander is intrinsically unstable because bystanders, in my argument, cannot for very long remain neutral. Over a period of time, if they continue just passively to watch, they're in effect condoning what they're seeing. They're allowing it to continue by not intervening. If they show sympathy to victims, or in some way try and provide assistance, go and get help, call authorities, they may be assisting the victim. Either way, they're moving in one direction or the other. They're not remaining merely neutral. The position of neutrality is only momentarily possible. And there is this notion of a moral bystander. A moral bystander is somebody who knows what's going on and is in a position, in theory, to intervene with some effect, and chooses to intervene or chooses not to intervene. So if you think of a very simple incident. You're taking your children home from school. You see somebody beating up somebody else. Your children, age 6, may not have the faintest idea what's going on, nor would they be in a position to intervene effectively. They are not moral bystanders if they choose to run on home and talk about something else and ignore the incident. If you're an adult who could, in theory, pull out your phone and remember to turn it on after the lecture, you could call the police. However, and this is what I'm interested in, particularly in this book, the wider context needs to be brought into account far more than it has been in bystander theory. A lot of social psychology of bystanders today looks at the possibility of calling for help, calling a teacher, calling the police or whatever. What I'm interested in is the situation of state-sponsored, state-initiated or state-condoned collective violence where you cannot call the authorities because it is the authorities themselves who've instigated the violence or who are whipping it up or who in some way supporting the perpetrators. So under extreme conditions, particularly wartime, conditions of genocide, extermination, there is no outside. So how can you remain a bystander? So these are some of the wider questions that I'm thinking of, and there you've got one of the photographs from the book, people watching a public hanging in Poland around 1941, and you sort of wonder, what are these people thinking? Many of these photographs, and I've looked through dozens of them, you see people holding cameras, ready to take a snapshot, ready to send it home, and there are innumerable photographs of public humiliation of Jews, hanging of so-called partisans, shooting of people. This was a very widespread, very public phenomenon, which I'll come on to talk about in a little while when I get to the wartime. But what are these people doing, taking photographs? They think they're witnessing a historic event. They're present at some terribly important moment. They want to preserve it. They've acquired some sense of being part of history themselves with a capital H. And are they permitting it to continue? We don't really know from the photos. So what I've tried to do in this book is to go beyond the snapshots of photographs where you can't tell if people are smiling because they approve of it, or they're smiling because their friend has just whispered a joke into their ear and they're party to some sort of oppositional resistant joke, or whether they're growling and scowling because the sun is in their eyes, or they've been standing there for a long time and they're hungry and they want to go home and have dinner. You can't tell from photographs. What I've tried to do in this book is explore in a different way how we can understand people's responses to the historic period of violence that they lived through. Specifically, I'm interested in what I call the muddled middle, which is not, you might think, a very good analytic concept. It's not really up there with precise historical terminology. But I think the muddled middle gets at something. People who could go either way, who were neither enthusiastic Nazis at the beginning nor absolutely determined to be political opponents. And this, I think, gets to the heart of some of the debates on the Third Reich. Was the Third Reich, as some historians argue, a consensual dictatorship, Konsensdiktatur in German, or was it a regime of terror held in place by force, power, repression, fear of concentration camps, which... Here again, these debates are very difficult to disentangle the current public discussion, the post-war self-presentations of Germans particularly, and how we can analyse the sources at the time. Because many Germans, and I'll come to this again at the very end, many Germans claimed we couldn't have done anything different. We were always against it, but we were afraid. And yet at the time, that is not the evidence we're getting. And when great historians like Richard J. Evans, for example, emphasise power, repression, terror, and other great historians say, no, we've got a huge amount of evidence of consensus and enthusiasm and all the pictures of the crowds waving for Hitler, where do you stand in that? Another great argument is about whether it was fueled by rabid anti-Semitism or indifference. Was Germany a perpetrator society, a Tätergesellschaft, or is there a real distinction between state and society? I should say at the outset, I am totally against, and I'll come to this in a moment, a view that Germans were peculiarly anti-Semitic, that there was a long-standing so-called exterminatory anti-Semitism in Germany. I'll come back to that. But also trying to argue against the Ian Kershaw. I really like Ian Kershaw. He's a friend as well as a great historian. And he had this wonderful phrase at the end of one of his books: the road to Auschwitz may have been built by hatred, but it was paved by indifference. I thought that was a wonderful phrase. But I actually think Ian hasn't quite got it right, because what he hasn't properly taken on board is the fact that indifference is itself historically and socially produced. And my argument is that indifference can be produced and can be changed by social processes, and particularly the interrelationships, the interpersonal relationships between human beings over a period of time. So I think what I'm trying to trace in part in this book is the historic development of indifference. It's not a given. So there are a lot of debates. One of the most fundamental, I think, is the Raoul Hilberg one. Raoul Hilberg, you'll know, the incredibly great historian of the Holocaust, who really set us running with this triad of perpetrators, victims, bystanders. And he uses bystander in an extremely vague way as essentially a moral category. He uses it to castigate everyone who failed to act, who could have intervened in time and didn't. It's really a moral category for him, and it's politically loaded. And he says, I quote, "The difference between perpetrators and bystanders was least pronounced in Germany, in Nazi Germany." Another two great contemporary historians, Andrea Löw and Frank Bayot, want to make a slightly different argument. They say, and I quote again, "There's a basic difference between acts of murder or supportive actions directly leading to murder and social behaviour that goes no further than contributing to social exclusion." I think there is a difference. But I don't think we can say it's a basic difference. And I want to argue that social behaviour that, quote, "goes no further than contributing to social exclusion" is actually a precondition for genocide. I think the social behaviour that excluded Jews from Nazi Germany and that caused or created a society which was prepared to see Jews as other, as Untermenschen, as vermin, is actually a precondition for the possibility of genocide. So I want to disagree, in a sense, with both Hilberg and Löw and Bayot. And the last point on this slide, the real puzzle to me is how could the European-wide extermination of European Jews have been initiated in and organised from Germany? When I think about Germany in 1932, and I have to confess here a slight personal interest in the background, my mother was a Berliner, my family on my mother's side came from Berlin, and I know that Berlin Jews in the early 20th century were the most assimilated, integrated in Europe, or certainly they were among the most. Western Europe was quite different from the situation in Eastern Europe. When you look at the pogroms in Eastern Europe from the late 19th century, early 20th century, after the First World War, the incredible violence that was unleashed in situations of economic and social distress after 1918, 1920, that was quite different, those pogroms, from the assimilated, settled lives of German Jews, many of them converted or intermarried. So it's a quite different situation. So how could what would have been unthinkable in 1932, when my mother was at school in Berlin, have become reality in 1942, when Auschwitz really started getting going, by which time my mother was safely in England, I should say. So this is my fundamental set of questions. My sources are, this is what really drove me writing this book. There is this most amazing archive of sources in the archives in Harvard University. More than 250 essays were written in the winter of 1939 to 40 by people scattered all over the world, some still in Germany, some in exile, some still in Europe, most of them actually in the States by then, for an essay competition run by 3 Harvard professors who were determined to try and find out a bit more about what was life really like for ordinary people. Could they write their life stories in an essay for a competition? You might think rightly, that to write for an essay competition you have to be literate, and therefore it's going to be a very thin sample of the upper bourgeoisie, the professionals, the literate classes. But actually people were so desperate for money that you get it across the classes. You get the occasional really working class person writing in agony, a woman, for example, saying her husband is a communist as well as a Jew, he's in concentration camp, she's trying to bring up their children, they're Mischlinger, they're being Mischlinger, you know, remember the inverted scare quotes, the inverted commas, every time I use these Nazi terms, they're of mixed breed. They're being discriminated against, her son can't get an apprenticeship, etc. She is desperate for money, and she writes a really scrappy, handwritten, semi-illiterate essay, but she submits it for the competition in the desperate hope. Some of the essay writers, in fact, did get small grants of money from the Harvard professors, or their plight was brought to the attention of others who might be able to give grants to assist them. So you didn't necessarily have to be a prize winner to get the money, but there were prize winners who got more. So there are people of a wide variety of backgrounds. Many of them are Jewish, and most of the work that's been done on this, published collections, Marion Kaplan, for example, has written a book using them, have focused specifically on the Jewish accounts and have talked about the Jewish experience. But I looked at a much wider cross-section of these essays, people who are not Jewish, some of them in relationships with Jews, people of mixed descent, people from different regions, different social classes, different generations, and different outlooks. And on the right there, I've given you just to give you an idea, this is one of the PDFs, they've digitized some of them. So just to give you an idea of what some of them look like, that's one of the more literate ones that I really enjoyed, a guy called Robert Broish, himself an Aryan, but in love with a young Jewish woman, Katie Dreyfus, and he's typical, his story is typical of the agony that people went through when they realized that they themselves were also being ostracized because they were in a relationship with somebody who was Jewish, and he had to really weigh up, am I going to give up the love of my life, Katie, we can never get married here, all his friends, his school boyfriends, his childhood friends, his adult friends when he became a teacher were saying, give her up, drop her, don't see her again, don't do it. And he thought, I can't. In the end, both of them, Robert and Katie, managed to emigrate separately. They got visas at different times. They reunited eventually in the United States. They did get married and lived happily ever after. I mean, I was able to trace his post-war life, but they remained married until death did them part. So that was really an uplifting story, many of them much less so. On the left, I've put a guy called Bruno Gaypart, who I will refer to again in the mid-1930s, but he's there with Goebbels going around an exhibition. He also is Aryan, didn't like what he saw developing, went on in his work as in charge of exhibitions, trade fairs in Berlin, right up and through the Olympics, doing the Nazi script, ensuring that gypsies and Jews and so on were not admitted to the exhibitions, were not present in, you know, putting the propaganda for the German woman and all the Nazi propaganda and talking to Goebbels, and he showed Hitler around on one occasion. But he too eventually decided he had to get out. So some of these stories are not the Jewish experience, they're other experiences, but all of them I think show, and the reason I chose particularly that group of essays is that they show the seam at which German society was being ripped apart most painfully. You could go to vast areas of Germany and find people who had never met a Jew, and they could be violently anti-Semitic or not, but they weren't interacting in their everyday lives with people of Jewish descent. What I was exploring was what happens in the everyday life interactions. So this was a very rich archival set of documents. But I wanted to take the story through the war. What's great about those essays is they're written before the war, 1939, summer of, and some of them in the very early months of the war, but they did not yet know about the Holocaust, understood as the mass organized extermination of European Jews. So they did not have what we consider the benefit of hindsight, how ghastly. They did not yet know Auschwitz would exist because it was not yet in operation as an extermination center. So they portray the minutiae of everyday life in a way that no later testimonies really do, because they don't remember the pain of somebody saying, I can't be your friend anymore. The most painful experience in 1934 when their best school friend dropped them. They don't remember the exclusion when their birthday wasn't celebrated in the factory where they'd worked for so many years. They don't remember those tiny things because it's all overshadowed by deportation and death. That's why this is such a rich source, I think. But you can't write the war years from just that. So in the book I used other sources for the war years, and I tried to take individual stories all the way through, finding where people were when they were born in 1912, 1916 or whatever, and then seeing how they survived the war. These are survivor accounts, unfortunately, the post-war ones. So, what is my argument? The first thing I argue, this is a very general, and then I'll take you through some of the stages quite quickly, so hopefully this will be brief because you'll be, hopefully taking you through the stages will be brief because you'll be very familiar with the history. I just want to highlight a few key points about it. But the general argument is the following. First of all, there has to be what I call resegregation in Nazi Germany. This was not a society that was segregated on ethnic lines in the way that many other European societies were. You have to distinguish between stigmatize and exclude quite actively. And what I'm interested in is the three factors in red there, which seem to me incredibly important in different mixtures, different proportions as time goes by. So I will come back to each of those three factors in the different stages of development. But impotence, a sense that you can't act effectively, that whatever you do, it will be pointless. And I'm sure many of you are feeling that about the Middle East at the moment. You may be feeling agonized about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, but feel absolutely impotent to do anything effective about it. Even more so when you don't live in a democracy, when you live in a dictatorship and you can't even raise your voice in protest. Indifference, which, as I've already said, I think changes over time, and ignorance. What didn't you know when, and why do you claim it after the war? So these vary according to conditions. I've put that picture there actually because I really liked it when I came across it. One of the characters I look at in the archival material is a young woman who was engaged in political resistance in the first couple of years of the regime, and she went around with her fellow left-wing group defacing these Der Stürmer newspaper boxes, the glass cabinets that were put up everywhere with copies of the anti-Semitic Der Stürmer newspaper in. And I thought this looks just like one that she would have been defacing because somebody has rubbed out un. So instead of die Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune, somebody scrubbed out the un and made it die Juden sind unser Glück, the Jews are our fortune. It's like rubbing out the miss in misfortune. I just thought, well, it probably wasn't Laura Tout, the woman I write about, but that's just the kind of thing she would have been doing, and clearly other people were doing it as well. But that's an example of somebody trying not to be impotent, but she too had to get out. So the stages of development, and I'll try and take you through them very quickly. I think there is a distinctly different period. The first 2 years of Nazi rule in Germany, 1933 to 35, it's not ignorance. People are very aware of regime violence. They're very aware of the crackdown on communists, socialists, political opponents being beaten up in SA cells, taken to prisons, concentration camps in the first months of the regime, in the first weeks of the regime. So you cannot say you did not know this was a vile, evil regime right from the outset. However, there is a temporary sense of impotence. One of the things that really struck me is how many people thought this will blow over quickly. Hitler won't be here for long. This is still like the Weimar Republic. The average length of a cabinet during the Weimar Republic was 8.5 months. And a lot of people thought, well, Hitler can posture and he can talk and he can give speeches, but once he discovers how hard it is to govern, he'll be out within 8 months. We've just got to weather the storm. That disappears after a while. You do see a very interesting set of developments in April. The two pictures I've put up, one is the April boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. Again, I'll just point you to that face, that smiling woman in front. Why is she smiling? Is she jeering? Is she thinking the Jews have got their comeuppance and they deserved it? We don't know. What we do know with that April boycott was that it wasn't very popular and that Hitler called it off quite rapidly because it was creating popular unrest. And what we find in some of the documents about how people responded to it is a certain cheekiness still. One of the threats, if somebody insisted on going into a shop to make their purchases, a shop owned by Jews, one of the threats was, we'll take a photograph of you and we'll publish it in Der Stürmer. And one of the materials I came across was a woman who just replied cheekily, well, if you do take a photograph, give me a moment to pose. I'll pull up my skirt at the back and turn my bottom to you, and then you can take a photograph of that. It's just being outright cheeky and a little bit rude. You don't get that later on. So there's still a certain sort of cheekiness about not conforming. More problematic is something I've put on the left there, the 7th of April law for the restoration of a professional civil service. This has not really been noted, I think, adequately for its consequences. Friedrich Reuss is one of the people I trace. He was an up-and-coming civil servant, coming from very good bourgeois professional family, great career ahead of him. He discovered in the 1920s that he had one Jewish grandparent who he hadn't known anything about, long hence dead, but when he wanted to join a right-wing student fraternity, they demanded 3 generations of ancestry. The Jewish grandfather popped up, so he was out. In 1933, he lost his job in the civil service. A single Jewish grandparent, a Christian, highly educated, top civil servant. By 1935, he's absolutely down and out. So a lot of people from even that very limited mixed breed background were on the skids socially and professionally in those first 2 years and excluded. Reuss lost all his friends. He couldn't invite anyone to his wedding. They all turned it down. He was very, very marginalized very quickly. So I think in some ways there's something going on, an undercurrent going on that's missed when we just talk about Germans and Jews as though it's a simple Nazi policies from above story. More broadly, this is a period of falling into line, and this is something that is staggering. The Nazis never won an overall majority in a national election, even in the most constrained circumstances. In March 1933, they only got around 44% of the vote. But so many people suddenly rushed to try and join the Nazi party, rushed to do, I hesitate to do it, I'll do it, the Heil Hitler salute in public. I should say that's another thing that's very interesting, and my mother used to tell me this. At school, when people were doing this, they used to say, the snow lay this high that year, that was the height of the snowdrifts. And they felt by muttering the height of the snowdrifts under their breath, they weren't really doing Heil Hitler. I think that is very typical of a very large number of people, and it comes across in the archival sources at this time. People who had formerly been socialists or communists, afraid of losing their job. There's this notion of beefsteak Nazis, brown on the outside, red on the inside. By day you put your brown shirt on, you come home at night and still the old red socialist once you get home. So falling into line is a very ambiguous process. It's not all Germans becoming enthusiastic. Mid-1930s, I think there's a distinct shift, and again this comes through in so many of the essays and the other sources I've looked at. There is a degree of learned ignorance and acquired indifference. Dropping of friendships happens very early on. If you've dropped your friends, you've, quote, lost contact, don't know what happened to them. Yeah, there used to be a Jewish girl at school, but I don't know what became of her. I lost contact. So I didn't really care anymore. And there's a sense of apathy, what I call apathetic impotence developing. Some people, it comes across in some sources, are sort of saying, well, I've got to go along with it, might as well believe it, I'm a bit more committed than I was. And you can see this even in very interesting things like in letters. There's a series of letters I traced, actually for my previous book, not for this one, a book on reckonings, where a Nazi is writing to friends and neighbours who've moved to another town, and for quite a while he signs it Heil Hitler in inverted commas, as if he's adopting the Heil Hitler salute at the bottom. And then by the mid to late 30s, he's forgotten to use the quotation marks. Heil Hitler has become second nature. And I think there's something going on about second nature by the mid to later 30s. Another thing that's going on is what I call shifting communities of identification. In the middle there, I've put the Non-Aryan War Veterans Society. Friedrich Reuss, who I mentioned, the single Jewish grandparent, he was excluded by the Jews because he wasn't Jewish. He couldn't get any help from Jewish community associations. He was excluded by Aryan Germans. And he joined a society for non-Aryans, not this particular one, but I thought that was a nice photo anyway, where he said it was like the Diabetics Association. The more of the offending substance in the blood, in your blood, the worse your outlook was in health terms. So, you know, Jewish blood. The humiliation of Jews on the left, that's a particularly nasty photograph because three Jews are being made to walk through town saying, do not buy in Jewish shops and businesses. They're being watched by presumably jeering onlookers who are not intervening in any way. And that is turned into a postcard which people could buy for months afterwards, continuing and perpetuating the humiliation. And yet, on the other hand, this great uprush of enthusiasm at the time of the Olympics, time of full employment, return to full employment. Germany is becoming great again. I don't want to do too many echoes of contemporary slogans, but make Germany great again, I think, has resonance today, unfortunately. Then 38 is a real turning point. The Anschluss, the takeover of Austria, is a really significant moment because in Austria, the processes that have been slow in Germany over the preceding years are really speeded up, very fast, very radical anti-Semitic violence. And by Kristallnacht in November 1938, you find something extraordinarily interesting, which is the polarization of German society. There's been a lot of debate about Kristallnacht. It's quite clear that a significant, large proportion, I don't know how large, minority, majority, it's not possible to say, but a significant number of Germans joined in with the state-organized violence. It's not a pogrom in the sense of spontaneous uprisings as Goebbels wanted to portray it. It's state-organized. But a lot of Germans joined in the humiliation of Jews and in benefiting from the smashing up of Jewish shops, plundering, looting, taking Jewish goods. On the other hand, a lot of Germans for the first time said out loud, we're ashamed to be German. That's when you first hear that phrase across the country, ich schäme mich, Deutsch zu sein. So shame. But what is also incredibly interesting is the combination of refusal to stand up in public, so passivity in public, no outright protest, and yet giving assistance to Jews in private, even people you didn't know. So it's not just the faithful friend who tries to hide a Jewish friend, it's also people who never knew you coming round and saying, would you like to borrow some of our crockery? Yours is all smashed up on the street. Would you like some food? Can I help you in some way? And the weirdest thing of all that I found about Kristallnacht, which it staggers me, is this. There are people in uniform performing their roles which further the Nazi project at the same time as showing sympathy to Jews and giving them help. One of the characters I look at is a guy called Georg Abraham, who is a trader, Jewish. He is arrested very apologetically. He's working with two farmers' sons who are both Jewish. He's Jewish, they're working on the land. The local jailkeeper has to arrest them, apologizes profusely, has been friends with the Jewish farmer for years. The jailkeeper's wife used to help look after the farmer's sons. He apologizes to the three characters. He takes them to the village jail and he says, look, I'll try and make it as comfortable as I can for you. Your wives can bring in a hot meal every every evening for you. I'll try and keep you here, ensure you're not taken off to a concentration camp, as was happening to adult male Jews after Kristallnacht. So here's this guy in uniform doing his role for the Nazi state while being kind to his victims, one has to say. And that happens again and again and again. This jailkeeper even organises a private car to take them to the railhead when they are in fact taken to Sachsenhausen, because he says it'll stop the hordes, the crowds jeering at you on the way to the railway station. So it's weird, this combination. You get other examples, particularly in the accounts of people who emigrated, of the official who is there to check their crates and make sure they're sealed and that they're not taking goods out of the country that they shouldn't be, and so on. Actually turning, winking at them, saying, what about your son's toys? Doesn't he want this? What about that? Isn't that a family heirloom? Don't you want to put that in? Now I'll seal it and say, yeah, nothing in there that shouldn't be. So you get this very ambivalent kind of response to what's going on. And that is, I couldn't quite decide what I made of it, because on the one hand, it does help to keep up the morale of individual victims. And some of them say, I never lost my faith in Germans. They are good people after all, or at least some of them are. For other people, though, it didn't work. And in a sense, I wondered with some of the stories I read whether it wasn't making the perpetrator feel better about themselves than it was actually helping the victim. So a woman coming to buy a house, an Aryanized, knockdown price house of somebody who's desperate to get out, will sell it at any price and can still do so. This is in Danzig, this particular case. And the woman who's buying it is saying, oh, I'm so sorry for you, this is really awful. You know, but she's still getting it at a knockdown price. And so she's winning both ways, in a sense, saying, I'm a good human being because I'm nice to Jews, but on the other hand, I'm benefiting too, and forget about that. So it's a very, very strange moment. And we don't quite know what to make of these silent onlookers who are looking on. Some of them, I mean, no longer can we say ignorance. This is why I'm really annoyed with that notion we never knew anything about it. What did they not know that they would have needed to know when they see people being marched off to be put in concentration camps in the late autumn of 1938? Some of the people, one of the accounts I read was written by the brother of a person who was taken off to Sachsenhausen and didn't survive. He died at the end of December 38. This is already fatal. And so not knowing about the gas chambers later, is that all you didn't need to know? This is why I'm bothered about this. We never knew anything about it. They certainly knew about this. Then we switch into wartime. And the war is distinctively different. I don't think you can in any way really claim to have been only an innocent bystander during wartime. You can have been an impotent bystander for sure, but you couldn't have been necessarily innocent. And my question is, you know, people, vast numbers of people move from being relatively uninvolved to becoming perpetrators simply because the vast expansion of perpetrator roles makes innumerable more people complicit. Perpetrators are not made by their biographies. You often get the impression in a museum where you see somebody in Nazi uniform and then you see he was born in such and such and grew up here, and you think, well, does his biography explain that he was in the SS? No. Actually, what explains perpetratorhood is the expansion in perpetrator roles in wartime. There's mass mobilization. 17 or 18 million young Germans called up, mobilized, part of the German army. Of those, we know that somewhere between 250,000 and maybe 750,000 were involved in killing Jewish civilians on the Eastern Front. It's a hugely controversial question what the numbers were. Some people say only 250,000, others say as many as 750,000, 800,000. But very large numbers of perfectly ordinary German young men land up finding they're having to shoot Jewish civilians. People in the police battalions, Christopher Browning's famous book on the reserve policemen in Battalion 101, it's quite clear these were people who were not motivated by anti-Semitism, but found themselves involved in deeply murderous anti-Semitic actions by virtue of their circumstances. I think that a lot of what goes on now is, among these people, is the justification of the violence in which they're involved in ways that they can justify to themselves and people at home. So exposure to the enemy, Judeo-Bolshevism, and so on, is a very potent ideological narrative that is particularly activated in places like Latvia and Lithuania, for example, where there's been recent experience of Bolshevik rule. But even young German soldiers going through Poland, seeing the Jews starving in the Warsaw Ghetto and saying, oh, it's just like in Der Stürmer. It's not just propaganda, it's real. Look, this is what they really look like. And sort of feeling that the stereotypes have been confirmed. So there's a process of change here in the way people use ideology. And anti-Semitism, it seems to me, is more a result of than a cause of the violence. It's a post hoc justification of what they're having to do rather than a motive for doing it among the rank and file. There's an exponential growth as well in camps, in ghettos, in civilian exploitation of forced labor, civilian administration of the annexed and occupied territories. So vast numbers of people become involved in what is functionally allowing the Holocaust to happen. Becoming an administrator is something, again, I wrote about in a different book, A Small Town Near Auschwitz, but becoming an administrator of an annexed, occupied, incorporated territory, whatever it might be, and you're charged with getting Jews out of their houses into poorer quarters, nastier parts of town. You're charged with cutting their rations. You're charged with ensuring that the curfew is observed and anyone found out of curfew is shot. This is creating the preconditions for deportation and murder. So large numbers of people become perpetrator. But there are also rescuers. And I've put Elsa Behrendt-Rosenfeld up there because she's one of the characters I follow through the book. She was born mixed breed, Christian father, Jewish mother, no, Jewish father, Christian mother, sorry, brought up a Christian. She met and married a Jewish man. Under the Nuremberg laws, she was therefore designated as to count as a Jew. In the early war years, she was desperately worried about the plight of Jews who were being deported from parts of Germany into the Lublin area, the camps and ghettos around Lublin, Piaski and so on. And she and a group of others, including Margarete Lachmann, a Quaker, organised sending parcels of food, medication, clothing to people in these camps, like one of the ones describes forced labour, standing in water, getting ulcerated feet and dying of various diseases and so on. So there are people who are engaged in maintaining contact, writing letters back and forth, and attempts at assistance. And some of these letters are really miserable. Margarete Lachmann, who was involved in that, was still involved in sending packages to the less privileged. I was lucky enough to actually meet her in person when I was a student. Before I started my undergraduate degree, I spent some time in Berlin, and she was a Quaker in Berlin at that time, packaging up citrus fruits to send to people in the GDR who never got to see southern fruits, vitamin C and so on. And my Saturday morning job was to go to Margarete Lachmann's flat, pick up a big package, taking it to the post office and posting it off into the GDR. And I never at that time wondered whether anything else was in the parcel apart from the grapefruits, but the grapefruits were heavy enough. In any event, that was Margarete. So there were people engaged in attempts. But then the serious moment comes, which is extermination. And here, these are pictures that you'll probably be familiar with. The incitement of local anti-Semitic activists in Lithuania, that horrific killing of Jews by smashing them in Litteraturhuset garage in Kovno, Kaunas. The pits in Panari outside Vilna, also the forests around Riga, where the Germans are using locals to do the killing. And there's this very interesting, and that's when the switch comes, August 41, the switch from killing people who could genuinely be seen as a threat, adult male Jews, partisans, to killing useless eaters, women, children, and so on. And there are debates there are a lot of debates here I won't go into, but I think what's interesting about this period from my perspective is this was very, very public, and moreover, the Germans were actually filming it and photographing specifically in order to show that it was locals doing the killing, because they were almost testing the waters of public opinion. They were ensuring that it was seen to be Lithuanians doing the killing, as in that bottom picture, the Skende beach just north of Liepāja. There were a lot of photographs of the killings in Liepāja which showed it was local people doing the actual shooting, not Germans. Germans were orchestrating it, but staying out of the picture, literally and metaphorically. What is also clear at this time is that locals were benefiting from it. That picture on the right I find really shocking. This Lithuanian had just been at the death pits. The Jews of his local town in Lithuania had been taken out. They'd dug pits, people had helped the day before digging the pits, the locals had been taken out, they've been shot, and he comes back and he auctions off their clothing and their possessions. That is very, very typical. Blood-stained blouses, shirts, anything. And again, you have to sort of understand, how are people being brought into this? They're not bystanders if they're benefiting from it, profiting from it. I think a lot of locals were, in a sense, unable to act differently. They were living in desperate poverty. They didn't know what else they could do. And I don't think everyone by any means was complicit, but some were profiting and benefiting. And that's a really difficult question for these societies to deal with later, when you go around areas of Eastern Europe and people don't want to know how their grandfather acquired the lovely house in which they're living. So this is where onlooking is and ignorance are really problematic notions. I've just put a couple of photos there of Germans watching deportations going to the east. I gather that in Norway there's been a big debate about, did people know where people were going when they were being deported in the autumn of 42? Well, Aryanization of their property meant they should have known they weren't coming back. But it's not really about knowing the details of what awaited them in the East. It was simply knowing these people were being outcast and taken away, and that they were unlikely to come out of it healthier and happier and richer. It's a fairly obvious point. And the kinds of photos, like you see the one on the right there, being sent home and people seeing these photographs, there is a lot of knowledge from the autumn of 1941 onwards that going east was likely to mean death. So you do not have to wait for 1942 and the emergence of the more established extermination camps. You don't need to wait for that. For the Reinhardt camps or Auschwitz to come into full operation. So let me conclude. What I'm arguing is that a bystander society is a set of social and political relations, really, conditions in which people will not lift a finger in support of obvious victims of murderous violence. And there are some, on the left-hand side there, I've put some of the obvious, broader psychological reasons why people remain passive: high penalties, high risks for resistance, and perceived benefits of compliance. The benefits can be, from 1933 onwards in Germany, getting a job where your professional colleagues have been booted out because they were Jewish and you get promotion, or even just doing well among your peer group. Perceptions and assumptions about the likely responses of others. This is really a difficult one. One of the incidents in 1938 in Kristallnacht that I was really shocked at, one person in a crowd seeing a Jewish business being smashed up, the windows being smashed, goods being taken out and looted, stood up and said out loud to all the people standing around watching it, "Look, stop this. We're not," I can't remember the exact words he used, but something in the phrase was, "We're not jackals, you're doing this like jackals, you shouldn't be doing this." Another guy just picked up something, coshed him over the head, and he was dead. So the risk is not to be underestimated. And if you think about the assumptions about the likely responses of others, if you thought all 200 of you who are watching, or all 20 or all 6, however many it might be watching something, would all act together. You might act differently than if you thought you were alone and the others would turn on you. So there's this weird phenomenon of not quite knowing how to size up the situation. But one of the things that interests me hugely is what I call communities of empathy, the sense of moral, political, or religious responsibility for others. I've mentioned Margaretha Lachmann, the Quaker. Many Quakers were active in rescue work across Europe, way out of proportion to their very small numbers overall. Or a sense just of basic, downright moral human decency. One of the people I've been interested in is a guy called Janis Lipka in Riga, ordinary dock worker who thought this is not right. And he organized a network of people saving, rescuing Jews from the ghetto, and single-handedly they saved probably over 50 people. He didn't keep an exact count, but more than a quarter of all the Latvian Jews who survived, due to his basic fundamental human instinct when he had witnessed thousands of people being marched down the road from Riga to the forest in Rumbala to be shot into a pit. He thought, I've got to help people get out. So communities of empathy, that's a really interesting question. And why is it that we're able to say, they're not us, we don't care, they're other, I'm not interested. So that seems to me really important. And the general conclusions I have are, go beyond the social psychology, which I think is, there's been a lot of work on it, but it's about the political and social conditions. What conditions foster indifference towards and discrimination against other people? What conditions foster choosing to ignore, choosing to turn a blind eye? And you can trace those through in 1930s Nazi Germany to see the growth of indifference doesn't pre-exist. And choosing not to know. The indifference and the ignorance go together, and quite clearly what fosters a sense of impotence is just not having access to any form of power or persuasion or authority. So those are the general conditions. And I just say afterwards, the notion that people were only an innocent bystander, I've just put up some of the things that Germans said frequently. We never knew anything about it, we were always against it, we only obeyed orders, we couldn't have acted differently, tried to help or save a Jew, we were also victims of dictatorship, bombing, flight and expulsion, blah, 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 blah. That's all true, in a sense, to an extent, but I think there's a real difference between what Germans say afterwards and what they were doing at the time. And there is a greater complicity than I really wanted to find. I really did not want to find the extent of complicity that I did, but I also think that there is far more differentiation in different quarters of German society than any of the sort of attempts to generalize about the Germans would lead you to expect. I don't think you can talk about the Germans or even the Norwegians or the Danes in that way. I think we have to have a far more differentiated approach to people's reactions to what's going on and their capacity for action in relation to what they feel about what's going on. And we need to have this more, I would just use that word again, a more differentiated approach to understanding this really dreadful period of history, which seems to me all the more resonant today as we are living through other really difficult moments in very different circumstances. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we'll have a good discussion.
Thank you so much for, well, it's a harrowing story, but interesting and thought-provoking. We have invited Ellen Stensrud. She's a political scientist and the research director at the Norwegian Holocaust Center to comment on the lecture. So please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture, Professor Fulbrook. Coming from the field of comparative genocide studies and the field of genocide and atrocity prevention, I think your book provide some very interesting challenges to this field, also in contemporary discussions, that I will give a couple of remarks on that. Although I know that you're very clear that you've written about German society in the 30s and during the war, but still, I can't resist the temptation to draw some contemporary lessons, if I may. I think that on an overarching level, the question of individual responsibility, agency, and actions in time of mass atrocity or genocide, individual acts and not least motivations, is among the most significant and also hotly debated topics within the huge field of Holocaust and genocide studies and research. And I think more specifically, of all different concepts in this debate, the term bystanders is perhaps the one with most sort of resonance today. It is perhaps the concept that has most significantly affected how we understand, rightfully or not, atrocities and genocide. And in the studies of other genocides, for example, the case of Rwanda, which has become sort of almost a laboratory of genocide studies, since there is so much documentation in the court, the archives after the various different legal procedures. This concept of bystanders and the different roles that people took on, either as bystanders, helpers, perpetrators, almost simultaneously, you can really see how Holocaust studies has left a mark on the wider field of genocide studies. I think also that the term bystanders, in a way, encapsulates so much of the sense that lessons from the Holocaust is eternally relevant, because in a way it addresses human nature itself. I think also, unfortunately, that in a way the popularization, if I may, of this concept has led to it sometimes being used sloppily. It's sort of as a label that's not really thoroughly discussed and sort of unpacked. So I think your book is a very useful correction in a way to that practice by insisting on a very deep and multi-layered understanding of what the term bystander means, and importantly by shifting the focus of to the societies in which individuals become bystanders or not. And I think also very importantly your point that being a bystander is something that is relational. I think that is really something that is a useful correction to the broader field of genocide studies, where this term is very often applied without really such a deep and thoughtful discussion. So, although Professor Fulbrook's book is about German society specifically, and as a historian, I'm sure that that's really why you sort of want to keep the discussion, but I mean, the book is so full of intriguing concepts and analytical frameworks, and for social scientists like myself, it's impossible not to think about how these can be applied to other instances of genocide and mass atrocity. Specifically, the terms that you presented here, ignorance, impotence, indifference, is a way of providing a deeper understanding of bystanders. And we are left then with analytic tools, a lens, if you may, through which to see other societies affected by mass atrocities or genocide, or even our own peacetime societies. In one way, the concept of bystanders then links this term, ordinary people, whatever that is, and thereby, in a way, ourselves, to the shifting political circumstances we all operate under and that influence all our social ties. Being a bystander to injustice, discrimination, racism, or sexism, whatever, in a democratic society is, as you argue in the book, very different from being a bystander to discrimination, exclusion, radicalization, and finally, extermination in an authoritarian and totalitarian society. Still, the concept of bystanders, in a way, is intuitively relevant to a broad spectrum of societies and of contexts. So my comments are, I have two sort of overall comments, and they, I think, are mostly relevant for your analysis leading up to the war, not so much the very extreme, radical extermination policies during the war, because that is a very particular situation, and also, fortunately, a very rare situation. I mean, I think that's something that's worth remembering, that it's a very extreme and very sort of unique situation. So, bearing that in mind, my first concept relates to the implications for how we understand the importance of different political regimes, regime change, and more, perhaps today, specifically democratic backsliding. This is, you made it very clear that your book is not a study of political elites or political governance, but I think it can very well be interpreted as a study of the effects of politics on society and on private relations even. So, therefore, in a way, the regime type, politics, political elites, governance, is a way, it's a constant present in the analysis, although it's not the subject of your analysis. As you cited yourself in your presentation, an observation that we often hear when we, in the study or in discussions of Nazi Germany and Hitler's rise to power, is the fact that the Nazi Party never got an absolute majority in elections. Sometimes this fact is used almost sort of as an apologetic argument that the Germans never really voted for Hitler, at least not in a majority. I think, however, that the fact that this observation can just as well underline some more disturbing arguments. First, of course, there is the argument that is very well known that despite this lack of an absolute majority, Hitler gained power through means that were sort of more or less legitimate within the democratic toolbook. Second, and more importantly for our conversation today, with only 30-something% of electoral support, although there was this election where they got 44%, but that was in a different context, Hitler and the Nazi Party could unleash a genocidal world war without an absolute majority in elections. So this fact, I think, is deeply disturbing and a warning in a time of democratic backsliding. So, in a way, the way I hear your presentation and see your contribution, it's a way of analyzing parallel developments or trying to understand the parallel developments of politics and society. Your contribution is, in a way, explaining how these political developments create sort of parallel ignorance, impotence, and indifference to what is happening in the political system. So, you mentioned yourself this "Make Germany or Make America Great Again" parallel. I mean, it's not possible not to think about that. And I wonder whether in situations of democratic backsliding, sort of neo-authoritarianism, if among the three I's, perhaps indifference is the most dangerous one, because as we know from the comparative study of democracies and democratic backsliding, the sort of modern-day authoritarians don't gain power through coups or through violent means usually, but rather through democratic means. So, yeah, I think also importantly, although you study a very extreme case of authoritarianism, namely Nazi Germany, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that in periods of political turmoil or regime change, those periods are among the most dangerous for minorities. So although societies are not sort of sliding towards totalitarianism, it can still be worth thinking about the effect of politics on society and individual relations, I think. My second comment is linked to the issue of genocide and atrocity prevention, which is sort of the field that I come from. I think your study is in a way quite a challenge to this field because it is focusing very much on states and states' responsibilities and very little on societies. In a way, you end your last chapter, your conclusion, in almost a positive manner, maybe not positive, but about the broader social and political environments that foster widespread passivity in face of violence. You write, and I quote, that for anyone who, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, wants to give more meaning and content to the oft-repeated refrain, never again, that is the analysis of the broader social and political environments. This may suggest many potential points for earlier or more effective intervention. It is then vital that we extend our understanding of the historically contingent conditions for the production of a bystander society, end quote. So, in a way, by suggesting that there are many potential points for earlier or more effective intervention, I think you're opening a possibility for intervening and for preventing genocide and mass atrocity before it's too late, before it's an imminent risk. But I think in this policy field there is still very much to learn and very much to figure out. There is some analysis on sort of the meso level of society, suggesting that atrocity prevention may happen most effectively on meso level, meaning civil society, religious organizations, unions, so the sort of community level, that level of society can create what has been termed resilient societies. And I think there is some resonance with your presentation in that you talk about shifting communities of identification. However, I think as sort of an international community, we are really lacking the tools to build resilient societies. And that has not yet become really part of the discussion on how to prevent genocide and atrocities. So, to sum up, I think you, through this analysis of indifference, ignorance, and impotence as the factors that lead to passivity in the face of violence, you have provided, in a way, a challenge to the field of atrocity prevention, how we can think about how the political conditions foster these three I's, and how we can build societies that are resilient against such passivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for your comments. I was well. Now we can open up for comments and questions from the audience. But first, I would like to ask you one thing. You are reluctant or opposed to use the term Germans in the general sense. But is it possible to, trace or discover a pattern based on things like geography, regional differences between the German populations in this respect, or gender, or generation, age, professions? Is there
I think there are a lot of different factors involved, and as far as I'm concerned, one of the problems is the rather simple way in which since 1945 Germans have been held to be those defined as such under the Nuremberg laws. So it's a perpetuation of Hitler's definition of who is a German. That's one problem I have. So people who thought they were Germans in 1932-33 and lost their citizenship are now defined as Jews, whether or not they self-identified as Jews. So we've got a basic problem there to start with. But then when you talk about any society, it's never as simple as using just one national term to define it. When you're talking about, and this really struck me looking at these different sources, when you're talking about pre-1933 or pre-1914 accounts, class and region and gender and religiosity seem to make a vast amount of difference to how people experience their lives and how they responded to others. So that if you're growing up as a working class boy in East Prussia, it's quite different from being the daughter of a wealthy entrepreneur in southwestern Germany. So I think we're sort of imposing a label on Germans that is constantly shifting and constantly changing. Any national identity is constructed, obviously, and changes over time. And what I'm really pleading for is to differentiate more when we look at political responses and outlooks and positions in society. So I get much more bothered by critiques of the Germans when it's not looking at who were the elites in 1933-34 who could genuinely have stood up to Hitler and done something different, rather than including in that the simple washerwoman in Dresden who had no option but to go along with it if she wanted to pay the rent and look after her kids. So that's why I'm just trying to say we just need to look at societies in a far more differentiated way. And not assume that the fact that they all spoke a particular language or had a particular citizenship at any given time made them something, because citizenship laws change, citizenship entitlement changes, citizenship is taken away, people speak different languages and are citizens of the same state. You know, it's just more complicated.
What about, is it possible to compare the situation, for example, in Poland, the Ukraine, the Baltic states to Germany? The situation there was quite different because most of the Germans there were either occupational regime or the militaries, while the response of the civilian.
This is something I touch on in the book, because what I try and do when I'm taking these individual stories, I try and weave through stories of people who either lived in or went through Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. So I take the Baltic states and Poland into the second half of the book. And you still get differences even among those who are held to be Germans, if you like. There's one character I talk about quite a lot, a Baltic German from who felt that he was rooted in the Baltics, that he was deeply entrenched, because there were a lot of Germans in foreign parts, you know, Deutschland im Austum, there's this sort of German phrase for it, who felt they were ethnically German and lived in other places. The thing to do is just to be precise about why do they claim German ethnicity and descent, what language do they speak, what is their social and economic relationship to fellow citizens of that state. You know, so you do have to look at it. And then the Germanization program, which is a whole new story of Germans coming in and trying to move out. That's something I talk about quite a bit as well, the forcible expulsion of Poles and Jews so that Germans or other minority groups to Germanize certain territories. So I think what I'm really arguing for is let's look at what's going on the ground. What do people claim about themselves and what are they doing to other people? Or how do they relate to other people?
Are there any comments? Can you give? Here's the first one.
Hi, my name is Frode Høyland. Thank you for the lecture and for a very interesting and I think important book. I have a question. One thing that intrigued me in the book is that you touched briefly on in the lecture is your theorizing or thinking about the dangers of performing Nazism, of conforming in a very, in a sense, innocent way, and the dangers that it like doing the hand or while thinking otherwise and so on. Which I think is an important concept, and you can maybe say something more about it, and then also reflect on the differences that Tom touched on. I mean, because the Poles themselves, or the Ukrainians, they collaborated and took part in many significant ways, and they hadn't performed Nazism before, but still, so there's a difference that maybe needs to be explained. And last, just more like a comment on the way that you wrote the book, which I think is also important, the way that you highlight the individuals also makes the reader empathize with them, which I think also carries an important message in the book itself, that these people deserve our empathy. Yeah.
Do you want me to respond to that? Yeah. Yeah, I do try to tell individual stories because I think that's the only way we can understand how things were possible or not possible and what people could do and how they thought about it. And that seems to me absolutely the essence of it. I mean, going back to Ellen's comments about political regimes and the effects of politics on society, I think it's also how people respond makes certain things possible for regimes. You know, the Nazis were testing out, in a sense, in November 38 to see how people would react. And precisely because there was widespread passivity in public, they knew they could go on, precisely because they could mobilize some support, and those who were opposed didn't dare to raise their voices in public. They knew that it was possible to push further. So there's a constant interplay between what's going on at the level of political processes and structures and what's going on in individual brains and how people think and talk to each other. And it's not just an individual response, it is ultimately an individual response. I do want to rescue the notion of individual morality from the determination of history, if you like. People do have to think about how are they going to act. And one thing can just tip the balance one way or another and make the world of difference to one person's life. Elsa Behren-Rosenfeld, who I mentioned, she turned from being a helper to being someone on the run. She hid. She decided not to go on the deportation train because she was aware that the Jews in her particular Jewish home were being deported to Riga, where they were being murdered, and she knew that to get on the train would mean certain death. And at the last moment, a Catholic nun just said to her, go for it, hide. And that Catholic nun just saying that to her gave her a moment of courage, which in her diary she said made all the difference to her decision. What made the Catholic nun say that? She gave her cocoa, which gave her a bit of, sugar and sweetness and a sense of faith or something. And then she got the train to Berlin, and there she managed to go underground and hide, partly with relatives on the Aryan side of her family, but they got frightened, and then she was able to hide with someone, we don't know who it was, an anonymous man who lived near Nollendorfplatz and just thought Jews should not be being deported, and he hid quite a few Jews, and there's some incredible stories in her diary about her. And then she moved on to other people. She finally got out over the Swiss border and was lucky enough there as well. She jumped over the border and broke her leg and crashed and couldn't get up and was taken to hospital where she recovered and was recognized. So these stories make a difference. We can understand how the history that is told in history books that can actually send you to sleep. I'm a professional historian, I teach history, I have to find things that students will read, and I look at some of these books and I think, God, I could learn all these dates, but what does it mean? You can only understand it as lived experience. So that's what I'm trying to get at. You mentioned the other Eastern European populations. That's something that I'm working on in my next project, which is about rescue and survival. Under what different social conditions around Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, could Jews have higher chances of going under, hiding, being rescued? Under what circumstances would members of surrounding societies be more likely to be complicit and benefit from the Nazi regime, or switch to hiding a Jew, rescuing a Jew. And there are so many complexities where people go back and forth. Well, they'll do one thing for one motive and then the opposite thing the next moment for a different motive, or we'll hide a Jew for a certain period of time and then shoot them because they're afraid of being found. You know, so it's really complex, and I think you have to look at it in that way. And if we want to get a better understanding of this incredibly complex, you know, the whole of Europe is engulfed in war and mass murder, and there's nowhere where people are not contaminated in one way or another. So it is a big collective undertaking of historians with different linguistic and area skills.
And I forgot to say that, please identify yourself.
Rolf Hobson, historian. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. One of the aspects of German motivation you didn't mention, but I'm sure you've thought a lot about, is the question of the well, why was there not a revolution in 1944 or 45? Because when there was one in 1918, and historians have emphasized the consciousness of complicity, the knowledge of the shared guilt, which sort of soldered the population to the regime. To what extent can one measure the importance of that particular aspect of motivation compared with others, you know, anti-Bolshevism and so on, on the basis of what you've been saying about the bystanders here?
That's a really big and difficult question. I think Goebbels wanted Germans to have a sense of shared guilt because he orchestrated that from 1943 onwards. As the war was turning against Germany and the bombing was coming, he actually orchestrated this discourse of the Jews are doing to this to us because of what we've done to them. By then, most Jews who were going to be murdered had been murdered, with the exception of the Hungarian Jews. But, you know, so it was a bit after the event to unleash that discussion. But there was definitely a sense of enjoy the war because the peace will be worse. You know, that was the joke that people were making in 44, 45. And fear of retribution because they knew this had been absolutely devastating. The thing that annoys me most, I have to say, is the July plot. Because 1944, for the elites to decide in 1944 that they actually wanted peace with honour rather than letting Hitler fight them into the ground at the end, and deciding then to go against Hitler when they could have done so in 1934, 10 years earlier. I got very irritated over many decades about the adulation of the July plotters in West Germany as this great resistance, because it was too late and for the wrong reasons. Why was there no revolution in 1918? All sorts of reasons, but really Germany was totally destroyed and the Allies were there and on the ground and occupying the country in a way that was not the case in 1918. In 1918, the army came out and was able to spread the myth of the stab in the back, and it was only a political revolution, not a social and economic revolution in 1918. It was only very partial and very... even more partial because the army retained its power, you know, so it was a change in political system, but not much more. So there are lots of ways you can play out the comparisons. It's an interesting set of questions.
Next one, I think, is on the second row.
My name is Ingjerd Veiden Brakstad. I'm an historian. Thank you so much for a compelling lecture. I was wondering if you could elaborate even more on the question of identity in Germany post-1933, maybe 33, 38, especially the question of an Aryan identity in the racial state, because Jews obviously were racialized, but so were the majority population. Do you find anything in your sources on whether or not people internalized an Aryan identity, and if so, when?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think it's one that's been overlooked far too much, and I do actually talk about it, because normally when you write about the mid-30s, you talk about the impact on the Jews, but not on the impact of non-Jewish Germans. And one of the characters I write about actually explicitly, he is Aryan, he explicitly says, my identity has been changed against my will. I do not like this. I do not want to be an Aryan predicated on excluding my friends who are now designated non-Aryan. His Jewish friends get out, and he in the end also decides he has to emigrate because he can't live with being compliant with the Nuremberg laws and with the new identity that's been imposed on him. So he emigrates and he lands up being interned and, you know, sent off to Australia or somewhere. So he's a very interesting character because he's quite explicitly worried about that. And I think that's one thing that's just not been written about enough. And it's why I do get annoyed that post-war it's just been taken for granted that the Germans were Aryans and the Jews weren't Germans, you know. So that Aryanization, although we wouldn't use the word anymore, has just become embedded in people's implicit assumptions about who is German, who is not. And being Jewish has been imposed on people who are Christians, who did not identify as Jewish, who were then had the racialized label imposed on them. So it's a very, very complex problem. One of the problems I have in writing about it is knowing how many scare quotes to use, because I don't want to perpetuate the Nazi terminology even more, but it was a fatal social reality, entirely constructed and imposed, and then became a deadly social reality. And that's really difficult to write about in a way that doesn't kind of perpetuate it unintentionally.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Hannah, and it was a very nice lecture. So at least looking at it from a biological perspective, I think that humans, like animals, you know, we used to feel that we had to be part of a group in order to survive in case there were predators and such, and it's still part of our brain and our natural instinct, I believe, at least. So perhaps the need to conform and be a bystander in order to be part of the in-group is a natural response, and therefore that isn't the main issue of like the Holocaust and allowing it, but perhaps instead how people allowed, or perhaps, but how society handles and continues to handle these extreme ideas when they're introduced, like Hitler and antis. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure I start from the same assumptions as you seem to start, because I think there are so many social and cultural variations in how societies develop and think about themselves and others that I don't think you can say it's a basic animal instinct. I think that there are certain fundamental things. I mean, if you think about prejudice or stereotypes or unwitting stereotyping, it is certainly true that it is essential to survival of humans as well as other animals, and I include us all in this, that we tend to make instant judgments about another and act accordingly, so that if you're walking down a dark alley at night and you see a bunch of young males clearly drunk, wearing hoodies and clearly looking for trouble, you think as a single female, I might just choose to go on the high roads, even though it's a bit longer round, it's got lights, there are other people about, I'm not going to go down the dark alley. So in a sense, we do stereotype, and it may be that those young men in their hoodies were just out for a merry night and we're not going to cause you trouble. But you do instinctively think, and there I do think there is this fundamental, and we immediately make up our mind on first impressions about people, but generally we go on to get to know them and talk to them and get second impressions and don't act in that way about everyone. So I don't think and I think societies vary so much in whether they are divided along certain distinguishing criteria or not. And you can introduce criteria for stigmatizing and discriminating, and you can work against those and try and get rid of them, so that, for example, homophobia, he's gay sort of thing in a playground can actually change dramatically, so that you just assume it's natural and normal to see single-sex couples walking around hand in hand in a way that maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago it wasn't the case, because legislation has changed, because cultural attitudes have changed. So it's possible to work against certain forms of discrimination. And that's why I think that cultural attitudes and thinking about this is so important. You know, states will legislate in one direction or another, and that has an enormous impact, but so too do people's behaviours to each other and the assumption of normality rather than exclusion and you look different, therefore I can't be your friend kind of forms of racism. So there are very, very subtle things in everyday life. I don't think we're limited by or restricted by some animalistic instinct, as you seem to suggest.
Hello, my name is Peter Schönberg. Do you have any more clarity on the propaganda machine of the Nazi regime? You mentioned the late war propaganda about the but do you have anything more about how the propaganda machine started and how that influenced your research and stuff?
Sorry, I couldn't catch half of that question.
Sorry.
I didn't hear what you
about the propaganda machine that Goebbels
propaganda,
started.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How that started and how that influenced the indifference, the ignorance, and the incompetence.
Yeah, propaganda was incredibly important, and Goebbels was a past master at it. But I think just as important and far less talked about is the enactment in everyday life, because what you find in the early period, the 1933-35 period, is people have been told about racial distinctions and they're trying to work them out. And there are innumerable funny stories of people trying to identify who is Jewish, who is not, misrecognition stories on buses and trains particularly. So people actually trying to incorporate this and understand what does it mean. Similarly, the things like you want to get married to someone, you have to get your doctor to stamp that you're both Aryan and of good stock and no no hereditary diseases. This is lived experience. It's not propaganda in the sense, it's just what you begin to think is how you have to live your life. And that is just as important, I think. So a lot of like the Der Stürmer example, a lot of that propaganda is so visibly propaganda that people could easily dismiss it. But the less visible, more insidious, perfidious impact of Nazi racial thinking is through these everyday life aspects. And that, I think, needs to be highlighted just as much, shall we say.
Tom,
I think that the session is drawing to a close, but do you have a...
Well, I wanted to comment on the question about identities and the response and the sort of social construction of identities, because I think it's, I think it's just really, I mean, there might be some truth to the fact that, we're a social animal, so we need our group, but they're all socially constructed, and the idea of the nation state is, in the long history of mankind is a very recent idea. So these are all constructed, but I think an important sort of lesson from other genocides is that you don't really need, a totalitarian state like the German Nazi state to ostracize minorities and to create great risks for minorities. I think many of these mechanisms are also present even in societies that are sort of democratizing, because they need to establish some kind of legitimacy, and the identity-based legitimacy can be a very powerful tool for that. So I think it's, although comparatively the German example is very particular, I think there are many of these mechanisms are quite clearly visible in other cases as well.
So on that note, I will thank Mary and Ellen for the contributions. It has been a very interesting evening, and thank you so much for coming and lecturing for us. And I would also like to thank the audience for coming. This is the last lecture this term, and we don't know when we will resume, but hopefully next autumn term. So thank you for coming.